everybody. Welcome to the German Pavilion here at the COP27. Very happy to welcome you to our panel here, Financing the Ramp-Up of the Global Hydrogen Markets, the Way Forward, and the First Experiences from Early Movers. That's right, we are talking already about first experiences. It's not only about announcements here, it's about things that actually happen. And I'm very happy that we have a very distinguished panel here today from all places of the world and from all kinds of experienced backgrounds. But first, before we start the discussion, I would like to invite Jennifer Lee Morgan to the stage to set the scene a little bit. She's the State Secretary and the Special Envoy for International Climate Action at the German Federal Foreign Office. If you've been around for a few days, you've seen her in several panels already, and I'm very grateful that you can be here to help us set the scene. Thank you very much, Jennifer.
Thanks so much. Dear Parliamentary State Secretary Stefan Wenzel, and dear panelists who have come to join us for a very important discussion, and Dr. Christina Falke-Grosse, thank you for your introduction and the moderation. Dear friends, dear colleagues, dear excellencies, I think it's quite rare, actually, that businesses, politicians, civil society, and even whole nations share the same vision. But when it comes to decarbonizing our economies, many of us currently envision a global green hydrogen market. And for sure, it's not the first time we're putting our hopes on a green gas to decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors. Yet this time, I think the sheer amount of global policy and business initiatives convinces me that green hydrogen will indeed play a key role in the global energy transformation, and that's been accelerated recently. However, we all know that a vibrant green hydrogen market, it's still a long way to go. Today, green hydrogen is still an infant industry in need of substantial support to become competitive and a real alternative to fossil fuels. Many countries around the world have already endorsed hydrogen strategies. They've set standards and they have adapted their energy legislation, which is good. But actually, to overcome the chicken and the egg problem of demand and supply of green hydrogen, there's another key input: money, finance. So innovative finance models that bring together public and private actors are key to kickstart the global green hydrogen market. Such finance instruments can provide capital as well as the much-needed planning security to investors, and thereby send a clear signal to potential off-takers that green hydrogen will be available and at what price. It's therefore my great pleasure to welcome all of you here to this panel discussion, Financing the Ramp-Up of Global Hydrogen Markets, the Way Forward and First Experiences from Early Movers, on behalf of the German federal government. And before we start, I just want to take a step back. I think this year's COP27 is taking place in very challenging times that deserve to take a look at the bigger picture. Russia's illegal war of aggression against the Ukraine does not only violate the UN Charter and further principles of international law, that's bringing tragic suffering and loss of life to Ukraine, but its repercussions on global energy markets also pose enormous pressure on many people and countries around the world, and I've heard many of those instances since I've been here. We all know that the energy transition is the backbone of decarbonization, and so the expansion of renewable energies like wind and solar, PV, the electrification of whole sectors, increased energy efficiency, all these measures are key to encounter the climate crisis and meet the Paris Agreement's targets. And the looming energy crisis points out that the energy transition, well, it's also a geopolitical issue and in fact key for our own energy security. It's thus a question of resilience in geopolitical as well as climate terms that the global energy transition succeeds. And the recently published World Energy Outlook, well, it sheds a little light on this situation. Based on the energy policies currently in place, the outlook for the first time, it foresees a decreasing use of coal power already in the next years, a stationary gas demand by the end of the decade, and a decreasing oil demand by the end of the 2030s. But clearly this is not enough to end the dominance, or fast enough to end the dominance of fossil fuels in global energy markets and limit warming to 1.5 degrees C. So therefore, we also have to focus at the same time, of course, as we have been, but we have to accelerate it on the solutions to the remaining challenges for the energy transition, and green hydrogen is one of those technological leaps. For some sectors, direct electrification is not an option, such as primary steel production, the aviation sector, or the chemical industry, to name just a few. For these hard-to-abate sectors, we need green molecules generated through power-to-X processes, which convert renewable electricity into green hydrogen. And then in subsequent steps, the hydrogen may then be converted into hydrogen derivatives, such as ammonia, methanol, or synthetic e-fuels, which are important inputs for many industries and can also facilitate the transport of hydrogen, obviously essential. And there's a lot of interest in producing hydrogen and its derivatives, yet we are still a long way off from a global market where green hydrogen and its derivatives are traded as commodities. Potential producers of hydrogen are ready to invest in multi-billion dollar projects and massively increase the production volume, but they require long-term offtake agreements from the demand side, thus the chicken and egg. The demand side, on the other hand, such as a steel factory or a chemical plant, needs to be sure that it can receive enough green hydrogen at a competitive price before investing enormous sums in new production processes. Therefore, we need innovative financing models that balance this risk-taking by public funds and massive investments by the private side. And the industry has already developed a pipeline of mature project proposals across the hydrogen value chain. But what's still missing are actual investment decisions, which crucially depend on the necessary access to finance. Today, some 680 large-scale hydrogen project proposals worth $240 billion have been put forward globally. But, and this is a big but, only 10%, $22 billion have reached final investment decision. And only 2 of these projects are located in the emerging markets, and only 1 of those has been commissioned to date. So in other words, there's an enormous gap between what we need to do and what we're actually able to do right now. And that's why I'm really looking forward to what Dr. Jane Ulwich will have to say, who is Managing Director of the Southern Africa Science Advisory Science Service Center for Climate Change and Adaptive Land Management, advances the development of the H2 Atlas Africa. I'm also delighted to see Rainer Backe on this panel, and apart from being the managing director of the Climate Neutrality Foundation, he serves as a special envoy for the German government to support hydrogen cooperation with Namibia, and I very much look forward to hearing what it takes to build up gigantic green hydrogen projects planned there. And despite all the talk, though, about green hydrogen, we sometimes tend to forget that this is still a nascent industry. But given its importance for addressing climate change and reaching energy security, we just can't wait until that market is mature. We have to move. And so governments thus play a very important role to stimulate this market by a mix of policy, taxation, and regulatory instruments. And they can also invest public resources to decrease risk and lever private investment, something that we have learned is absolutely essential to move forward. Some governments are already deploying novel financing mechanisms, and I'm proud that the German instrument H2 Global will feature in this debate today. The instrument is lauded as a good practice for financing the price gap between green hydrogen production and demand, and may become the inspiration for the European Hydrogen Bank, which was announced by Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in her State of the European Union address. Therefore, I'm glad that Timo Bolleri, one of the inventors and main protagonists of H2 Global, is joining our panel today. And similarly, very pleased that Ed Weber, Deputy Director for International Net Zero Financing and Sector Transition at the UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, will share his government's perspectives with us. Hope that they can all be here. I am very interested in his insights from the work on the hydrogen breakthrough, which also stresses the importance of finance. So while financing green hydrogen projects is still not an easy task for anyone, countries of the Global South often face particular challenges in organizing the necessary capital for project implementation on the ground. And one prominent actor in financing energy and climate projects are multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank and its international finance cooperation. And Vivek Pathak will surely tell us more about this important role and how multilateral development banks can help finance the hydrogen revolution. So instruments such as H2 Global, the European Hydrogen Bank, and other financial instruments address different risks. How they will impact the emerging hydrogen economy and what their exact leverage will be is still unclear, though. So Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we're at almost, well, the very beginning. We're on the way, maybe not at the starting point, but we're very early on. And thus there is an urgent need to develop the financial structures for investment, to understand the role of public funds will have to do to de-risk investment and lever private funds, and to determine how public funds can gradually retreat once hydrogen and derivatives are traded as commodities on the world market. These are tumultuous times, but they also harbor great opportunity. New opportunities, I would say, in developing countries for a new industry to move forward. And we want to seize it, we must seize it, and work together to make the green hydrogen vision a reality. So thank you very much for your attention, and look forward to the great panel here. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, State Secretary Morgan, for this introduction. And although the problem of finance is not only a problem for the Global South, but it's a global problem for everybody that is right now trying to invest or trying to come up with solutions to hydrogen, I would like to start first, also not with the challenges and with the problems, but more with the opportunities and with the outlooks. So Jane, please come to the stage with me here. Have a seat, and please maybe say a few words about your background and what you think. What are the opportunities in hydrogen for the Global South and maybe for Africa in particular?
Okay, thank you very much, moderator. First of all, maybe I start with the last question. There is a lot of potential for green hydrogen, and particularly in SADC countries and the whole of Africa. So anyway, my name is Jane Orwatch. I'm currently the Executive Director for SASCO. And before that, I was the Managing Director for Earth Observation at South African National Space Agency. I am originally from Rwanda, but my whole work has been in South Africa. I'm an academic previously, and my area of expertise is climate change. So definitely I have passion for climate change. As all of us, we are looking for solutions, and green hydrogen has come at the time when I think we are all looking for what to do next. So there is a lot of potential, and there is a lot of need. I cannot overemphasize that we are all struggling at this time with the energy crisis. And even before the war in Ukraine, Africa is always described as an energy poor continent. And then one wonders why, with all the fossil fuels, with all renewable energy, and we are still really strained with the energy resources. So that alone makes green hydrogen now something that we can look up to. And also because with green hydrogen, we are going to exploit the renewable energy resources. And of course, as the topic says, the German government, through the Ministry of Education and Research, BMBF, they have really moved early enough through the funding of the H2 Atlas Africa. And SASCO has been very privileged to coordinate the Southern African country, and my colleague from WASCO is here, who was also coordinating the West African side. So of course, without data, without local data, without capacity building, we cannot be confidently say we can produce green hydrogen. And we can also say investors are now confidently ready to invest, because what are we investing on? So that's why the H2 Atlas, that's really the only and the first reference data set that we can have and say, this and this country can produce green hydrogen, and this is how much it can produce, and this is how the cost actually is. So the data set we have collected, a lot of data, land eligibility, renewable resources, climate projections, so much. All that will now be able to come up in an atlas that will say, this is a hotspot, this is a not hotspot. So we are very excited. And of course, later on, maybe I'll be able to talk about also the joint communique of intent that was signed by German BMBF and the Namibian government, and to say we are very excited because the first project was the Namibian green hydrogen strategy, and it was launched this week. Then again shows you the German government through the Ministry of Education and Research and SADC countries and West Africa. We are the early movers, and whatever we have will determine what the next steps are going to happen. But I think I'll have more time later to talk more. So it's exciting times. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jane, very much for this introduction and for this overview. And indeed, it is an exciting time. There's a lot of potential, and I'm very happy to be able to start on this happy note, and I hope we can end on a happy note as well, this discussion. But we will lead to challenges and problems, and with this, I would like to also invite all the other panelists that we have here. Rainer, Vivek, please come over, Ed, and join me in the panel. And also online we have Timo Bollahai, who joins us from Hamburg. So we discussed the potential. We want to discuss a little bit the challenges as well, and we also want to discuss the solutions. But first, may I say we have 6 free seats here. If you don't want to stand all the time, please feel free to also come. I will keep the panelists here so we can take the seats in the front of the row. I would like to dig right into the problem with our panelists, together with our panelists here. And I would like to say the challenge right now, as our State Secretary already said, is the volatility of the market, the instability of the prices, the questions of certification, of standardization that is still ongoing. So investors are not safe. They don't feel safe yet to invest. And all that hampers the offtake, and all that hampers the production of hydrogen. So what can we do? What can we do as governments? What can we all do to support the market ramp up? And what can we do to support the confidence of the investors? The problem, let's just assume for this discussion here, that the problem is not the technology, and the problem is not the interest of governments and companies. We see a lot of interest everywhere. And let's just, for fun, assume that we don't have a problem with the commitment to finance. Let's just assume that we have to discuss on where and how to go and what it is that we want to achieve. I'm not saying that finance is not a problem, or the grants of the government is not a problem, it is. What we want to discuss is where to go first and how to use the funds as efficiently as we can. We see a lot of commitment from the United States with the new IRA. We see the commitment of the German government, of course, of the European and many other countries around the world. We are ready to support, but we have to know where to go and what to do. We want to be most efficient with the funds. We want to be most sustainable with the funds. We want to invest where this investment is needed most for CO2 reduction, but also for development purposes. And we do want to be as fast as possible. Ms. Morgan already said we need to be quick to be able to achieve some results. So essentially the question is, who should be investing? Where should we be investing? Where should we support with finance instruments? And how should we invest? Which are the instruments that are most efficient and address the needs? So this is the session that is on this topic, brainstorming a little bit about the solutions, about the challenges, and also about the solutions. We're happy to get feedback from you, also questions from you a little bit in the end of this session. So please get ready if you have questions, keep them in mind, and we can take them up here. Maybe first I would like to start with Ed. Last night, we had a discussion where you also introduced the major action points from the Breakthrough Agenda, and maybe you can just screen a little bit the challenges and the problems and also the opportunities that you see from that point of view. Finance is one of the action points that you've pulled out.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Christine. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Breakthrough Agenda, first I'll say my name is Ed Webber. I'm from the UK government, the business department there. I have been overseeing a project under our COP presidency called the Breakthrough Agenda. I'm very pleased to say that after this COP is over, it will fall underneath the joint jurisdiction of the Clean Energy Ministerial and the Mission Innovation Ministerial. So we will be internationalizing, graduating that piece of work to the international level. What that piece of work is trying to do is develop an annual cycle through which the global community can look at each individual sector that needs to be transitioned and understand where we are in that progress and what urgent further international action we need to take together in the next year to really try and speed up that process. So we've been running that process this year. There was a report in September from the IEA, IRENA, and the high-level champions, the Breakthrough Agenda report, and I thoroughly recommend it. It's a good read. That produced 25 recommendations for further things we need to do in a series of sectors: in power, road transport, steel, hydrogen, and agriculture. And today, this morning, we published 25 priority actions that respond to those recommendations, all time-bound, quite specific actions that we need to try and deliver by COP28. So yesterday's conversation was trying to explore that in a bit more detail with those initiatives who are really the deliverers of some of those actions. So let me just run through the four big ones that we were talking about. The first was around standards and certification. I think everyone recognizes that's a kind of foundational layer that you need to really give those signals to investors, the confidence to those who are procuring, the clarity for trade agreements to roll out and so on. So we are making a big push now with that coalition to try and drive forward those mutually recognizable standard certification over the coming year. The second big area, which obviously is highly relevant here, is around demand creation and trying to magnify the confidence that investors have to be able to invest in hydrogen. And we see various different approaches to this. For example, the First Movers Coalition, which the UK and Germany are a part of, which is around bringing some of the world's biggest companies together to create private sector procurement commitments and to try and drive that demand signal. We see other approaches like H2 Global and the sort of CFD's approach, and we've been quite inspired by that in the UK. We're trying to roll out a similar approach over the coming year. But perhaps that is a scalable model that we could take into other places. So there's a big piece of work we want to do, which is try to look at those different models, work out which are perhaps most applicable in different jurisdictions, and see how we might be able to get behind them and scale them over the foreseeable future. The third area is far more around the early stage deployment of the first sets of these hydrogen valleys, as they're often called. I think we've learned in other sectors that the first even half dozen first projects you build, you're going to learn a huge amount about how to do them much, much cheaper next time. So yes, it can be very, very expensive and difficult, but actually it's totally worth it because you will absolutely drive down that cost far faster. So with particularly building around the work of the Mission Innovation hydrogen mission, there's an opportunity, I think, for the global community to try and get behind and identify the first, say, 100 most promising hydrogen valley projects and try and get them done as fast as we possibly can and share those learnings so they can be applied in other jurisdictions over the foreseeable future. And the final area is indeed the pure finance piece. Now, there are, I think people have probably seen over the course of this COP, a number of different announcements of different platforms, different models, different possible approaches to technical assistance, to financial assistance. I can think in the UK's case, we've already launched this week 2 brand new funds. One is around R&D, which includes grant funding for early stage entrepreneurs, including in the hydrogen space for developing markets. And also this morning we've launched with our Swedish colleagues the first dedicated concessional finance program under the climate investment funds. Now that is potentially quite a scalable tool that could really be quite helpful for many of these emerging markets. What I think what we need to do now is try and consolidate some of this work, because what we have seen in other sectors in particular is that it can be quite difficult to work across multiple different relatively medium and smaller size pots, but actually aggregating them together through things like the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, that's a potential route that we can actually really give the scale and easy access to this kind of investment we need in emerging markets over the foreseeable future. So watch this space, but that's where we're heading.
Cool. Thank you very much, Ed, for the introduction. We will come to that because with scale, also the complexity rises. So this can be a challenge as well. But there are different approaches to different challenges, and then we will have a little bit of time to discuss that. Timo Bolahai, you were one of the first ones, at least that I know of, that recognized the problem, the chicken and egg problem that Jennifer Morgan was referring to. And maybe on the basis of what Ed just told us, maybe you can just give us a little bit of insight of how you came to the conclusion and what basically your analysis of the challenge was, just in a few simple non-banking terms.
Absolutely, yes, Christine. Yeah, I think maybe just a little bit of background. Most of my professional career I spent in the finance industry. So I was on the investor side actually, and it was around 2.5 years ago that I was asked by the German government also to bring in institutional investors into a hydrogen project in Northern Africa. And when I looked at the investment setup there, I just came to the conclusion that exactly we have that non-investment case from a, let's say, institutional investors' point of view at this point in time, due to that chicken and egg situation that Jennifer has already described, because we have various layers here, different layers that were already being touched upon earlier in this. First of all, starting with a huge price gap between the production cost of green hydrogen and the price that can be achieved in the market. Then we have also the lack of security, legal security that we've already been said. All the standards, the norms that are not yet in place, the regulatory environment, which is pretty much only about to be shaped over the next couple of years. That all creates a huge amount of investment insecurity. Then what investors need is long-term offtake agreements, what we heard already. It's sort of the normal standard long-term PPAs, power purchase agreements, similar aspects we need also in the hydrogen industry. And that on top with a combination that we have most likely declining margin costs for the production side. And that makes it extremely unlikely that at this point in time, an investor from a project investor, but also institutional investors could step into putting really money to their mouth. And that's exactly the situation that we see. We see MOUs being signed every day. Jennifer just said 600 projects in the pipeline, only 10% really going from talk to action. And that is what we need to address with, let's say, with overcoming that momentarily situation, with that uncertainties, provide de-risking strategies to it, so that investors, projects, but also the guys with the big pockets, the institutional investors. I used to work for Allianz Global Investors, for example. They're sitting on millions, on billions that they want to invest for their clients also into a green economy, but they are lacking of investable assets, of investable projects. And that is what we need to overcome.
Yeah, thank you, Timo. That's absolutely right. We have the price gap challenge, we have the regulatory insecurity challenge, we have the declining production costs, and then also we always say it's not the chicken and egg, not only chicken and egg, it's chicken and egg and rooster problem, right? Because we also have the trade insecurities and the problem of missing trade relations and global value chains in this field. Thank you for explaining that and outlining this, because we also, and we will come to that in a minute, have a few approaches on the solutions there. But I would like to turn to Vivek, because you have a lot of background in the IFC on the question of what are the challenges from the very banking point of view in the current situation, a little bit like Timo already outlined. And what do you think? I mean, with the cost of difference approach, I mean, the stuff that is in the market already that governments are thinking about, is that enough? Does it only take time, or are there other instruments as well that we should think about?
Sure. Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much to all of you all in the government of Germany and BMWK for having me. When I started talking about green hydrogen at the IFC about a year and 11 months ago, people were laughing at me. And I haven't studied as much in a long time as I've been studying green hydrogen. And in fact, I did a 4-day trip through Germany to study more and to learn and see what's happening there. And it's truly fascinating. I'm going to make an analogy on what happened in solar with hydrogen, because I think Germany was a leader in solar, and Germany in many ways really can take a lot of credit for driving down prices in solar. And that happened through a combination of factors. It happened through scaling up. It happened through what I would effectively call blended finance or subsidies, because solar tariffs were much higher than fossil fuels, but you all subsidized them, as did later a few other countries in the European Union and other parts of the world. And we also had technologies changing rapidly. So these three factors contributed to solar tariffs, which in some markets are down to 2 cents today in emerging markets. And therefore, it's no surprise that Germany is again taking the lead in green hydrogen. So I want to touch upon a few points. I think one is what we are seeing is, I'll touch upon what is the problem. The problem for me is very simple. There's a lot of talk and a lot of bluster. And that is, I was just at a panel on decarbonization of steel, and somebody got up and said that they are working on hydrogen prices coming to below $1 in the next 2 years. Yeah. Now, if you were a government, would you want to take an offtake today at $3 or $4? You wouldn't. You'd wait for prices to come down. So a lot of pilots happening, but what we really need urgently is to get these pilots off the ground and to scale up here. And I think there are 2-3 things that we need for that to happen. One is, I think, we forget that green hydrogen comes from something called H2O, which is water. And water is in huge shortage. I mean, you look at the drought that just happened in Kenya and other parts of the world. And so then people tell me, well, we can do desalination. Well, that adds to the cost. That's another 30 cents. Then what do you do with the brine from the desalination? You just can't throw it back into the Red Sea here. We'll never come back diving ever again. So there are all these costs that we need to factor into account. The second thing is obviously the supply chain around electrolyzers and the prices of electrolyzers. And I think, we need to focus on that today and not 3 years down the road, because without electrolyzers, these projects are not going to take off. And I really think what we have to be investing in a big way right now is electrolyzer capacity. And if there's one place I would love to put blended finance is in electrolyzer capacity, because we need to drive down the price of electrolyzers. If you don't drive down the price of electrolyzers, remember it's a fixed cost. It's like your solar panel, Once you've installed it, that's it, 20 years is there. Now electrolyzers are less, it's about, I'm told, 8 to 10 years, but that's still a long time. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is we really need renewable energy, solar and wind at scale like we've never seen before. And you need plant load factors of at least 75 to 80%, what they say, but technologies are evolving here. So we need to look at this comprehensively and then say what is needed for these pilot projects to be scaled up. So we need 3 things. We need blended finance, we need blended finance, we need blended finance. And that's the work that you all are doing, I think, the $1 billion fund that you all have to. So one way of doing blended finance is sort of putting the money in, you have an offtake at a higher price. And the one project that I think is about to take off in the Middle East is where a large European fertilizer company is saying, we'll have an offtake at a higher price. It's going to be part of our overall mix. So that's fine. And then prices will start to come down. So I think we really need a combination of these factors to make it happen. And I want to touch upon a very sensitive topic, which from our perspective as IFC, the World Bank, is critical, is the geopolitics around this. Whether it's in supply chain. Second is, just imagine if there's a country which is producing green hydrogen and it's being exported to part 1 countries or the developed market. You don't want the populations and eventually the politicians in these countries saying, this is my sun, it's my water, but I'm not benefiting from it. And I think when we structure these deals with your capital team, we need to look into account how does that country benefit? Because otherwise, at some point in time, it's going to unravel, and I think it's important we tackle it today. So whether it's an agreement that X percentage should be sold in the local market, I think that's important. So I would come down to how is the financing going to happen is, we either need offtake contracts at slightly higher prices than what markets are today for fossil fuels, that's the comparator, and or we need blended finance. But where I would really want capacity building, and when I say capacity, not as in technical assistance capacity, is in the electrolyzer capacity to go up there. I also think, and that's how as prices will start to come down once you start building, you scale up, technological improvements will happen, but it's electrolysis. It's a 100-year-old, if not older, chemical process. It's nothing, but there are people who are talking about new processes for green hydrogen, which I've yet to see where that could be a game changer. But let's wait and watch. But let's remember that electrolyzers are a fixed cost. Renewable energy is a fixed cost. Those prices, once you've installed capacity, those prices aren't coming down. So we need to drive those prices down today and start these projects, scale them up from pilots, and I think that's how it's going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivek. Scaling up is exactly the key. Again, talking about complexity, but also talking about the need to really get a lot of volume to bring down the prices. This is what we want to do, and this is what we want to see. But you were also mentioning, as Ed before, the first mover disadvantage that we have. So first mover advantage in the sense of being the first, having the lessons learned, but the disadvantage of having the high prices first. And with this, I would like to turn to Rainer, because you've already gathered some experience and some background there. Rainer is the managing director of the Climate Neutrality Foundation and also the special envoy for the BMWK in Namibia. So I would like to ask you to tell us a little bit about your experience in Namibia, because we do see cases of application there already now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christina, and good afternoon, everybody. Before I talk about Namibia, I just would like to say that the situation today reminds me very much about the year 2000, when we started with our support scheme for renewables. At that time, and you just pointed out, the price of solar was 50 cents per kilowatt hour. Then we drove through the learning curve, and today, even in a country like Germany, we produce solar for less than 5 cents. And the same thing has to happen now with hydrogen. And if I look at the studies that are available today, everybody predicts the costs are going to come down dramatically. The cost of renewable energies, the cost of the electrolyzer, and the overall system cost. So an investor could think, okay, then I'll wait 10, 15 years, the prices are going to be better then. Well, then they're not going to come down. Somebody has to walk through that learning curve now. And this is a first mover disadvantage. And so what the public sector has to do is help the companies to move through this learning curve so that indeed in the future we have a good market, a good global market. Now, Namibia. First of all, I would like to point out that this was not an idea that came from the German government or from a German company. This was a Namibian decision. After the last presidential election in Namibia, 2019, the president said, we need a new economic strategy to get this country out of the very difficult economic situation. So he took some people from the outside and asked them to write down a strategy. And the people told him, well, first of all, we have excellent solar conditions. Second, we have excellent wind conditions. Third, we have space. And let's produce hydrogen. And since hydrogen cannot be transported by ship, they said, let's turn that hydrogen into a derivative, produce ammonia, because ammonia then we can ship to Europe. And Europe, on its way to climate neutrality, needs huge amounts of ammonia. That was the beginning. And then they had a tender process. And out of that tender process, a company with the name of Hyphen came out as the preferred bidder. And Hyphen consists of the South African Niklas Holding and the German company Enatrag. At the beginning of this year, Robert Habeck, the German Minister of Economic Affairs and Climate Action, signed with his counterpart in Namibia a cooperation agreement. And after that, Robert Habeck named me the special envoy. So let me just say a few words about what this project actually is going to look like. Namibia is one of the driest countries in the world, so it would be immoral to take fresh water. So the first thing is take renewable energies, take salt water, desalinate it, and then transport this desalinated water to the desert where the future electrolyzer plants are going to be. Then use huge amounts of electricity from wind and solar, split that water, H2O, into oxygen O and H2, that is hydrogen, and then transport the hydrogen back to the coast, take atmospheric nitrogen and produce ammonia and ship that ammonia to Germany. The amount that can be produced by this one installation is equivalent to about 50% of the ammonia that Germany uses. Now, I'm not talking about exclusive relationships. I'm telling the Namibians, diversify. I'm also arguing in Germany, diversify. But just to give you an idea how much can be produced with this very first company, this is going to be 50% of the biggest consumer of ammonia in Germany. So when you look at the excellent conditions of wind and solar in Namibia, and there's probably, at least in this combination of wind and solar, no better place in the world than this southern part of Namibia, then you ask, well, where's the problem? Because if you only look at the production cost, this green ammonia can be produced almost cheaper than the gray ammonia that we have today in Germany, if there wouldn't be the problem cost of finance. Namibia is part of Africa, and the interest rates in Africa, including Namibia, are at least 10, 11%. So every percent of interest translates into several percentage of increase of costs. So the one real big issue is, how do we bring down the cost of finance? And I think that's where, the thinking really has to start. I think that Germany, with this wonderful instrument, H2 Global, already has an instrument, but this is already for projects that are further developed. And if we really want 2026, for example, first ships leaving Namibia, going to Europe and delivering green hydrogen, then some of these wind generators, electrolyzers, and solar panels have to be ordered now. This company cannot, at this stage, participate in H2 Global. So we need new ideas. We need, for example, something like a CD, a contract for difference, something like a minimum price, not for all of it, but maybe only for a part of it, but something that gives the banks the confidentiality that this is a project that is economically feasible. Then, of course, we need the infrastructure, because it doesn't make sense to transport ammonia to Europe and there's no infrastructure to bring it to the consumers. And, of course, we need more competence in the Namibia government, because there's a completely new industry. And, of course, the administration is right now not equipped for that. And I think we need a lot of support to make sure that at least 90% of the positions, and I'm not only talking about the blue-collar workers, I'm also talking about the white-collar workers. The game of this project is that at least 90% of the workers, and we are talking about a 5-digit number of workers, are going to be Namibians. And then there's another last point that I think is very important, and Vivek, I think you touched on it. Everybody in Namibia is asking, well, what am I going to have from this project? Well, I think it is very important that this consortium Hyphen offered the Namibia government 25% ownership. Yeah? So there is going to be ownership of that country, and revenue from selling that ammonia is going to come back to Namibia and help the country to economically get steps forward. So 15,000 construction jobs, 3,000 permanent jobs, and revenue for that country, I think, is a big, big step. And the amount of money that is going to be invested there in this very first project is equivalent to the gross national product of the entire country. So we are really talking about a big step. It's a win-win situation for Germany. Germany needs these green molecules for its pathway to decarbonization. For Namibia, it's a big step forward. And by the way, there are 2 more wins. Namibia, with this project, can become the first African country with 100% renewable energy, because there's so much excess electricity to decarbonize the entire grid. And a country that right now is importing 60-70% of electricity, for example, from coal generators in in South Africa, will not only abolish these imports from coal generators, but will sell renewable energy into the South African power pool. So it's really a win-win-win-win situation. Or let's talk about an opportunity right now, but we will make a big mistake if we would not make sure that this opportunity becomes reality.
Thank you, Rainer. This is a really good and hopeful outlook of what we can achieve and what we can together as partners achieve there. But it's not that simple. We still have some challenges to go ahead with. Some of them you mentioned, the 3 of them that you mentioned, blended finance, blended finance we want to address. But you also mentioned capacity building is also something that we need to get the workers on the ground. It's an essential part to get all these projects realized. And maybe then, Jane, just let me come back to you, because you wanted to mention also the cooperation. And Namibia is only one example of many countries around the world, but let's just stick to that. Yeah. You mentioned the MOU between the BMBF and Namibia. Maybe you can say a few words about that as well.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I agree 100% on the opportunities that green hydrogen provides, but I'm also a believer of step-by-step approach. And in that case, I would like to highlight the joint communique of intent that was signed by the German government through BMBF and Namibia. And the joint communique of intent is worth 40 million euros. And in that joint communique of intent, BMBF is funding the Namibian green hydrogen strategy that was launched last week. Also, it was shown here, I think, this week. And also, it includes the scholarship. So we have, the BMBF has set aside 5 million euros for scholarship. And as the implementer of the program, we have already issued a call. And I can tell you the interest in the young people was overwhelming. We got over 1,000 applicants in a period of 2 weeks. So we are busy now trying to finalize to finalize the selection, and this is going to cover for capacity building at master's level and also vocational. And we hope that the vocational training will cater for big projects like Hyphen. So there is already a foundation for that. But also the joint communique of intent includes big pilot projects. It's important for us to realize that we have never in the African continent produced green hydrogen at such a big scale. And that's why through the funding of German government and through BMBF, pilot projects have been thought about. And these are like demonstration green hydrogen production plants. And these will prove the concepts under the Namibian condition. And only then, in my opinion, can we actually be able to know the cost of green hydrogen in our countries. So there are already steps that are making our countries ready for mega projects like this. Mm-hmm. And of course, this is something that is very important for us, and also I think for all the investors and for Hyphen, so that when they ultimately set out the project, then there are young people who will be able to work in the solar panels, in the wind, and in everything else. Yeah. So this is really, again, an exciting time for us. But as I say, step by step, so that we have the information that will guide the production and the implementation of this mega green hydrogen project. But yes, the politics is there. The science will be there in the next few people. We'll have the young people doing the work. And I mean, we cannot go wrong. It is the right time.
That's right.
Thank you.
There are a lot of elements that have to be considered, right? At the same time, all at the same time. Otherwise, you cannot move forward in some point. Yeah. So capacity building was one important thing, but we want to get back to finance as well. So maybe I can turn again to Timo, because H2 Global was mentioned a few times already. But just for a few people in the audience that may not have heard of H2 Global yet, you can explain maybe in 2 or 3 sentences what it is about. But then also outline, Timo, I am aware that you've been thinking about additional instruments like investment funds or development funds that can connect to the instruments. And I would like to ask you if we have an instrument like H2 Global and then maybe also other instruments that Rainer mentioned as well, minimum price. I mean, how do you see that? Can we have several instruments at the same time? And what do we have to do to make sure that we are not just going wild, but have a real concentrated approach on what is exactly needed?
Exactly. I think also Ed, he also mentioned, we should have all the instruments working together and not against each other. I think that is exactly what we need. We need to have the right power in the instruments by combining them. And maybe before I go into different instruments that could work together or where could fall together also with the approach of H2 Global, let me explain a little bit what H2 Global is trying to achieve. It tries to achieve to provide the lack of, or to overcome that lack of investment security by providing price security with long-term offtake agreements, market security, and legal security. All these 3 elements that are the main hurdle at this point in time to take an investment decision today. And we do that by implementing a physical intermediary. We call it the HINCO, the hydrogen intermediary company, between the supply and the demand side. So unlike a classical CFD mechanism, this is a real physical intermediary, which means it's also the contractual partner on the supply side and on the demand side. And Hintco does something very stupid, because Hintco purchases a product at a relatively high price in the market at this point in time and sells it much cheaper, most likely into the European market. So Hintco is already bankrupt from day one if there wouldn't be a subsidy scheme where the German government, BMWK, your team, Christina, would come in and say, listen, I've got some funds made available for the first round of auctions in the vicinity of 900 million euro to compensate for that cost of difference between the high purchase price and the lower selling price that Hintco achieved in the markets. On the supply side, as I said, Hintco provides long-term off-take agreements, creating that investment security. But on the demand side, we only sell on the short end with one-year contracts. And we do that for a very specific purpose, because we want to be a very market-based, competitive-based instrument. And we on-sell this into the European market on a yearly basis, because we assume that the market price that can be achieved for those green products, the green premium, will rise over the next 10 years for the duration of those power purchase agreements that we enter into. Now that obviously would minimize the cost of difference that the government, the taxpayer, needs to compensate for. And in addition to that, we also create very important pricing signals on the supply side, but also on the demand side. Because next to the big point-to-point contracts that might going to develop through projects like, for example, in the Middle East that are being developed, we need pricing signals to create a liquid market. And that is also what we're trying to achieve here with the approach of H2 Global and the Hintco model. And in the beginning, as you mentioned, we already thought about aspects like what Rainer Barker just mentioned in Namibia. There's a certain hurdle costs also to apply, for example, under H2 Global. And I think these needs to be addressed by an early stage development facility that could be implemented, for example, allowing to cover, for at least through grant elements, for example, to cover also parts of the developmental costs to enter and to develop such kind of projects that could participate in tenders under H2 Global, for example, but also skills development. All these elements that needs to be taken into consideration, they need to be addressed to enable those countries, especially in Namibia as a good example, with the different financing costs that are applicable, to allow those countries and those regions to become part of that global commodity trade. On another level, we talked about it earlier on, is also how do we really get the institutional investors, the institutional funds going, because obviously public funds are limited and we need to use them wisely through blended finance instruments to mobilize that private capital that is out there, it's abundant there, that wants to be invested into green assets, into green hydrogen. And how can we do that? And I could imagine, for example, that we have a double or a de-risking strategy, de-risking on a project level, for example, through instruments like H2 Global, where we de-risk the project through the long-term offtake agreements, which are subsidized. And on a portfolio level, on an institutional portfolio level, where we would bring in blended finance mechanisms from, for example, from the public side, but also from philanthropic investors, blending that with institutional funding, and that in combination providing the right financial instruments to invest in these projects that are, for example, participating under H2 Global, that would have that effect that we bring in institutional investors, mobilizing funding and bringing in different elements that could connect into offsetting the hydrogen economy here.
Okay, which basically means that we, as a government, have to jump in to make the first step, first mover disadvantage come in, maybe with instruments like H2 Global, very market-based. The winner is determined by the price or by the volume. But then also we have other instruments that you've mentioned, investment fund, development fund, or the minimum price that was mentioned already, to get into markets that are more not so price competitive yet, maybe, because the cost of finance is so high. So we discussed already who is going. The government has to go first. The governments have to go first. Institutional investors will have to come after. We did discuss already how, so what are the instruments that we can use, but I also wanted to touch upon the question of where. And this is where also, Vivek, you said something about geopolitical aspects already, and also I would like to ask Rainer, and maybe you too can also comment briefly. I mean, we do have a where question here in the room, diversification of supply, a question not only for Germany, but for the whole world. So maybe, Rainer, you start, and Vivek, you might want to add in.
Well, we see right now in Germany, in Europe, but particularly in Germany, that we made some real big mistakes with our trading process by trusting Russia and making ourselves dependent on Russia. And then came the attack on the Ukraine, and we got into a real big problem. So the debate, what do we actually learn from this, has only started. I would say one of the key lessons is we have to choose our trading partners in the future carefully. Yeah? And democracies don't attack neighboring countries. So when we talk here about support schemes, I would not say it doesn't matter who benefits as a country. I would like Germany to actually make the global south, those countries that live by democratic standards, rule of law, freedom of press, a special offer. Give them special access to our market. Because I think that should be one of the lessons that we learned from the mistakes that we did with Russia. I would like to address another point that at this point of time doesn't seem to be really relevant in the political debate, but I guarantee once we're going to be successful, this debate is going to come up. Because right now we are not only the biggest in Germany, we are not only the biggest consumer of ammonia, we are also the biggest producer. So we are talking about the production of ammonia going away from Germany. So this debate we still have ahead of us. And I think we have to be very clear. I am of the opinion ammonia production from natural gas in Europe does not have a future. Because in this country, in Germany, that's 11% of our natural gas imports in the industrial sector, and it's 6 million tons of CO2. So there is no climate neutral Germany with using natural gas to produce ammonia. And if we would use the very few resources that we have of wind and solar trying to produce green ammonia, this green ammonia would come at a price that the products that are being produced with that green ammonia would not be competitive on the global market. So our real choice is, are we going to lose everything? I mean, ammonia is being used to produce fertilizer and all kinds. It's a very important feedstock in the chemical industry. Are we going to lose everything? Because our industry is going to look, where do we have the best, most competitive, cost-competitive production? So maybe all of that is going to go to countries like Australia or Canada and so on. Or do we want to keep these part of our value chains in Germany, but then we need that green ammonia at a cost-competitive price from somewhere else? So that's another part of the geopolitical discussion, that we have to convince our own people that this is a real intelligent strategy, because otherwise we're going to lose much more than only the ammonia production.
And this is something that we should not do by coincidence, but we should do by choice. So policy
Exactly.
choice, thinking about it very early. What is the structure of our industry? What is the resilience of our industry? And at the same time, diversification and production at home to weigh these things. Thank you, Rainer, for this contribution. And Vivek, please also.
So I've got 2-3 other points I'd like to make, but let me touch upon this. So we are a multilateral. The way we are viewing this is, again, where you have the cheapest cost of renewable energy, which can be scaled up quickly, where do you have good good logistics, transport, because that's critical, especially if you're going to export the ammonia. And third is we also need to look at domestic use of ammonia. So a great example actually is Brazil. So Brazil is getting more and more important as an important supplier of food after what's happened in Russia and attacked Ukraine. And guess what? Brazil was importing most of its fertilizer, I'm told, from Ukraine and from Russia. So suddenly you've got a situation where we've got a food security crisis, food price inflation, and a big alternative could have been Brazil. So, and Brazil, interestingly enough, has a lot of renewable energy. May not be exactly where you need it, but we need to consider all these factors. So cost of renewables, the availability of water, and logistics are the three critical things that we would look at. Then obviously each country makes its choice in where they want blended finance, who wants to provide blended finance to whom, and that's a different decision which we don't get part of. But I wanted to just make two quick points. One is the importance of linking what's happening in green hydrogen to the food security challenge we're facing. Because agriculture is responsible for over a quarter of global emissions today. And I think this is where if green hydrogen, green ammonia going into fertilizer, I think is a way we can quickly reduce the carbon footprint of the agricultural space and hopefully in time reduce costs as well. Because one problem today is when you've got gas price volatility, a farmer can't afford higher prices of fertilizer overnight. But when something like green hydrogen, where your costs are fixed, you can have an offtake price, you can provide if you want a subsidy to the farmer, but there's at least a level of certainty that the farmers have on what is the price of fertilizer going to be. And I think it's really important to make that connection. And I'm really happy to announce that a few days ago, our managing director has showcased a $6 billion food security platform that IFC has launched. And we would really like to use part of this for the production of green hydrogen, which will go into ammonia, which will go into fertilizers. So that's one thing very important. When you're looking at green hydrogen, we need to also look at food security and decarbonizing the agribusiness supply chain. The second point I want to make when this whole debate on financing is coming, today we're looking at green hydrogen for ammonia for fertilizer, but if this is to scale up and prices have to come down, we have to be ready to export hydrogen as is. And you need a whole ecosystem, a whole logistics system for that. Somebody said, well, you can use gas pipelines for hydrogen. I'm told you can't. I'm not an expert, by the way, but I'm told you can't. You may need special ships, special port facilities. The private sector, I don't think at this stage is going to finance that. And that's where I think you need public capital coming in today. Once the sector picks up and these port facilities and these logistical facilities and all are viable, I think it's going to be great to flip them to the private sector because that's when they'll come in. Yeah. I honestly don't see the private sector taking that risk to put in hundreds of millions, if not of billions of dollars of what I call the ecosystem for green hydrogen. And let me end by saying I'm so glad both of you all brought up the point on capacity building. I'm calling it upskilling and reskilling for climate. So it's not just for green hydrogen. You need it for, if you need to have green hydrogen at scale, we need wind turbines at scale, we need solar farms at scale. You need a whole ecosystem around climate where those jobs may not exist today, and that the vocation and the training needed for those jobs probably doesn't exist today. And I really think governments need to start very, very seriously looking at that right now. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Absolutely, Vivek, thank you. But we are back to the rooster problem again, because the rooster was, as you said, infrastructure, the question of transport, the question of how to make that viable. So chicken, egg, rooster, the government has to think of all three of them to really make sure that we can finance these first mover disadvantages in all areas that are affected.
Sorry, let's please stop saying first mover disadvantage. Okay. Because people will run away. We need to crowd capital in and people in. So.
Okay, let's be a bit more.
Let's call it first mover innovator or something.
Okay.
Something like that. I'll think of
we'll find a good word for that.
Sorry.
But I want to pick up one point about what you said about Brazil, because you're absolutely right, and this is something that we are thinking very hard about. The local use of the ammonia, of the hydrogen, of whatever is produced is very important, because after all, it's about decarbonization. We should decarbonize where it's most efficient. However, we were asking the question about this first investments that need to be done when prices are still high. And the question is, where do we do them and how do we do them? And do we do them at scale if we do them in countries where there's no, like for example, carbon pricing, where some of the finance at least comes in because the offtake is set as an interest to actually buy, then the cost of finance and the cost of capital and the cost of difference essentially will be higher than in markets where the offtake is already a little bit guided through ETS system and carbon pricing system. Isn't that the case? So wouldn't that also make a difference in the question of the structure of finance?
I think it would, but I think that's where, so 2 points I'd like to make there is what we've not talked about is carbon credits. And we need to start today on getting Gold and Vera to start verifying the methodologies that green hydrogen would qualify for carbon credits. Here I just want to make a quick point is, I don't know if it's gone through, but the last draft I saw of the EU taxonomy was not very favorable for the definition of green hydrogen because it had to be a captive plant. Many countries, India today is spilling 21%. Chile is spilling a lot of its solar and wind today. So we need to be a little more flexible, but carbon credits are going to be critical and that will again drive the price down. Yep. So it's a combination of factors. So I gut feel tells me what you're saying, but at the same time, I don't think I earn a living by working in developing countries, so I'm not going to say you shouldn't go there. I think we need to find innovative ways to get where it makes most sense, where you have a cheap cost of renewables, because then remember your logistics costs are going to come down. So it's really important that developing countries are not left out. And I think what happened in solar and wind was we started out with Europe, Germany, then Spain, Portugal, and then slowly it came to emerging markets. I honestly think, to put it bluntly, we don't have the luxury of that time today. The battle for carbon is being fought in emerging markets. That's where growth is happening at a scale you've not seen. That's where urbanization is happening. Mm-hmm. So I really don't think we have the luxury of saying, let's start here, then we'll move there. The situation may be different, but I would really want to make a plug for the fact that we can't ignore the use of green hydrogen in ammonia for fertilizers in emerging markets.
Yeah, absolutely. I am conscious of time. We have quarter an hour, and I promise that you will be able to ask some questions. So if you do have some questions, please indicate it to me. And there is one already and another one here. So let's take another 5 minutes for the question and answer.
Yeah, thank you. I'm from the Netherlands. My government is also closing a lot of deals, for instance, with Namibia as well. And I have to say I'm a little bit concerned about it. I understand the need for green hydrogen in the energy transition, but the scale of the amount of deals that are being closed is worrying me about real-world consequences. I only hear technical and financial hurdles here, mainly, but this is going to cost a lot of space in countries. There's not empty space anywhere on the world, so this is going to have an effect on the people that live there right now, on the biodiversity. And it's going to take away energy from people that sometimes not even have an energy supply, let alone a green energy supply in the country itself. So how are all these real-world negative impacts addressed in the agreements that governments are closing together? Because if you make a deal as a government with another government, you have a responsibility to make sure that this takes care of nature, takes care of biodiversity, and takes care of the local people as well. So I'd like to address that as well.
You are right, and it's very important that you mention that. I think that is a problem in many countries and in many cases right now. Also in Germany, I wouldn't say that, we are always the very first point to think about that, but it's very important that it comes up. But for the case of Namibia, I think we do have a good example, and I trust, Rainer, as you are from the Foundation of Climate Neutrality, you thought about this in Namibia.
Well, we didn't only think about it, we took a very close look because all the points that you just mentioned are very, very important. The site that the Namibian government, it was not the Germans, be it a company or government or the Netherlands Dutch company. It was the Namibian government that said we want to have this tender in this region. And the region that they chose is the so-called Sperrgebiet. This is an empty desert. There's no public access. Nobody lives there. There's no farming or anything like that going on. The only activity that is happening there is mining for diamonds. So what the Namibian government now has to do in order to make sure that this project can be realized there is also withdraw some of the mining licenses. So nobody is being displaced or there's no interference with any native people or agriculture. It is just simply desert. Second of all, desert doesn't mean that there's no biodiversity issue. And I was indeed very worried about this because all you have to do is look in the internet and you see that this part of South Africa and all the way up to the Namibian coast there is one of the biodiversity hotspots of the world. It's a pretty unique one because it's really a desert place and it is a site of important species. So we took a very close look at that, and fortunately this project stays out of the sensitive areas. And there is a very thorough environmental assessment right now that looks at the very, very concrete sites, and this is being done by very credible people who probably would rather cut their hand off before they write anything that somebody else would like to read. So this is a very important concern, but in this concrete case, this is not an issue. So right now, I only see benefits for the environment and also for the people of Namibia. But I very much agree, this is one project, and that doesn't mean that this project that meets all these criteria also means that automatically in other countries or in other parts of Namibia you have the same condition. You have to have a very critical view. I talked to the German environment organizations. I once used to be also director of one of them, and they have developed, like, I think, a 12-point agenda for what they consider as standards for these kinds of investments in the global south. And I went through with them, and they said, also according to our opinion, all of these standards are being met.
We have to thank you, Rainer, for this insight. It's calming for this project, but only through dialogue, through ownership of the partners that we work with, and to the inclusion in the discussion of the stakeholders. We need to, we can really achieve good results in this case, and I'm also concerned that this might not always be at the first thought of everybody developing these projects. We have one more question here. I also want to bring Ed in, one more, and then we need the final words of the State Secretary. So please, very brief question here, or comment, very brief, please.
My name is Petr Hlobil, I'm with BankWatch. I have a question, how you actually would like to resolve the tension between the EU industrial strategies and the developing country strategies. Because here we're talking about the ammonia, which is basically a raw product. 80% of ammonia is used for the fertilizers. And the fertilizers are much higher in the value chain. So that's a much bigger opportunity for the developing countries' economies. But obviously, EU would like to keep upper, higher chains and just using Africa, continuing using Africa as the sources of raw materials, except it will not be minerals, now it will be ammonia. And there is also other issues which are happening already in Europe, and that's because of the Russian invasion, but already before that, gas prices was driving the fertilizer and other industries for the shutting down their productions. Like in Slovakia, they already did October last year. And so there are the different interests within the EU and of the developing countries. So I'm just wondering how you do want to find the right balance.
Mm-hmm. To be honest, I think this will be a question that cannot be solved here and now, not with one sentence, but I'm very grateful for you to raise this issue. I think there are quite a few formats of exchange between the EU and also the African continent, but also other partners to trying to address this problem. But the dilemma between industrial strategies in one part of the world and industrial strategies at the other part of the world is probably not easily solved. But Vivek, please.
I completely agree with you, by the way. This is what we've been propagating. It's really up to Africa. They've got mineral resources. It's up to them now. How do they do value addition onshore and export them in a sustainable manner, in a decarbonized manner? Because what's been happening is copper goes to one country, it gets converted to copper wires, it then comes back to the continent, or it gets exported elsewhere. But really, this is in the hands of the continent and their leadership. And I think the multilaterals are standing by to support them in this. It's up to them to say, we want to add value. Now, you can have a one-off project like we're talking about, but going forward, it's really up to the countries them to say, how do we add value to our mineral resources? But it has to be in a decarbonized manner. That's how they're going to have a global market. And coming to your point, 30 seconds, if I may say, we as IFC have very high environment and social safeguards. He's aware about them. And if you'll use us, we will make sure they're implemented. So please use us when you're investing in green hydrogen.
Okay, thank you very much. Ed, I wanted to bring you in that you can say a few words about how you want to proceed with the action points that you've delivered. And you already mentioned it's international. But I'm afraid I have to cut you very, very short, maybe just one sentence, because we need to bring the State Secretary in for the final remarks.
Absolutely. So I'll try and be very, very brief. Just focusing in on the finance and investment action alone. I think what we've heard today is that there probably is no silver bullet. You need a portfolio of different instruments to address this. And what we want to do is identify those combinations of portfolios and provide a mechanism to try and help aggregate and coordinate them into emerging markets at scale. So come back at COP28 and hopefully we'll have something to showcase along those lines.
Absolutely, we are all working on that, and that's very good to have an integrated approach and somebody who's overlooking it. Thank you for your initiative. I would like to invite Stefan Renzel, Parliament Secretary, State Secretary at the German Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action. I still have to read the title of my own ministry. Please come in and say the final remarks. Thank you.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear panelists, for a very interesting, rich discussion, even with the last questions we heard here. And how to design financial mechanism to ramp up market for renewable and low carbon hydrogen. Thanks to all speakers and also to our gifted moderator, Christina. And there are a lot of questions we're discussing now, and we see some more questions we have to discuss in the next days. I will aim to summarize this discussion and suggest some next steps in a minute, but allow me to make some general points beforehand. The production of renewable is one of the dominant topics of this year's COP. There are announcements on memoranda of understanding to be signed, projects to be developed, new initiatives to be launched, and financial pledges to be made. All of this is a great news, of course, because we need to expedite our efforts to defossilize our economies. The clean energy transition is key for reaching our climate goals, as well as for increasing energy security for all. Now more than ever, we need to move away from an economy that is based on fossil fuels to a world fueled by renewable energy. As you all know, this is a gigantic task, as it requires to increase renewable energy deployment 20-fold by 2050. Yes, despite all the pledges and announcements, we are still a long way from a vibrant global market in which renewable and low carbon hydrogen and its derivatives are traded as commodities. At the same time, the climate catastrophe continues at an ever accelerating pace. We must therefore act as fast as possible. Also, there's still a large gap between announcement and actual finance projects. I don't want to sound pessimistic. It is highly reassuring that the pipeline of hydrogen projects is growing and maturing. This is all the more motivation for governments to come in and provide the support. Governments are ready. Development economies are already setting ambitious policy targets for hydrogen imports. The European Union has put forward an ambitious hydrogen target of 20 million tons by 2030 as part of the RePower EU plan to phase out fossil fuel imports well before 2030. This includes a 10 million tons target of domestic European Union renewable hydrogen supply, as well as 10 million tons of renewable hydrogen imports from outside the European Union. Potential producers of green hydrogen are ready to invest in multi-billion-dollar projects and massively increase the production volume, but require long-term offtake agreements from the demand side. The demand side, on the other hand, such as a steel factory or a chemical plant, needs to be sure that it can receive enough renewable hydrogen at competitive price before investing enormous sums into new production processes. In such a situation, there's a strong case for government action. We need to establish mechanisms to ensure that we are moving from strategies and agreements to investments in projects on the ground. We in Germany try to do our part as well. At any hydrogen conference in the world, H2 Global is applauded as the most important financial mechanism to bridge the gap, to bridge the price gap between the supply of renewable hydrogen and the demand. For ammonia, on ammonia, the first tenders are committed to increase the funds dedicated to H2 Global fivefold in 2023. But this is not a German mechanism for the German industry. No, as Timo Bollerhey explains, this instrument is already being used by the Netherlands, which recently also committed to join H2 Global. And hearing the European Union's Commissioner's Vice President Franz Timmermans speak at the European Hydrogen Week at the end of October, I'm quite hopeful that H2 Global can become a role model for the European Hydrogen Bank. This financial mechanism and all the technical assistance provided by Germany and other nations hopefully enable developing and emerging countries to make good use of their abundant potential for renewable energy. We remain our partner in the climate neutral transformation of our economy and as recipient for export of renewable hydrogen and its derivatives. This ties well with the shared commitments of the G7 energy minister that culminated in the launch of the G7 Hydrogen Pact. This pact aims at facilitating the kickstart of the global hydrogen economy, foremost by overcoming the chicken and egg dilemma of hydrogen supply and demand. G7 made it clear, ramping up global markets for hydrogen and its derivatives is a key enabling step towards a full decarbonization of our economy. The G7 Hydrogen Action Plan includes a strong financial commitment for the market ramp-up of low-carbon and renewable hydrogen and its derivatives, thereby signaling an irreversible shift towards a world economy based on low-carbon and renewable energy sources. But the G7 HEP is not about financing and investment only. It also deals with hydrogen standards, certification, and demand creation, to name just a few. Please join us on next Wednesday, 16th November, in the German Pavilion at 3 p.m. for a discussion on the G7 Hydrogen Action Plan. It will include a speech by the incoming G7 presidency, Japan, and reactions from the private sector on their demands on the G7. Ladies and gentlemen, dear panelists, the rich discussion we had today and the good ideas of our panelists and from the audience will help us to improve our financial mechanism and coordinate our efforts even better. I can assure you that this was not a one-off interesting debate. The discussion will continue with a joint G7 HEP, breakthrough agenda workshop in Berlin on the 1st of December, for example. Thanks again to Ed and the Breakthrough team for joining forces of our two important initiatives. Governments, investors and project developers will identify gaps that hinder a rapid market ramp-up of hydrogen and derivatives. The discussion will continue, surely, to ensure that action can and will happen very fast. Thank you to all speakers, the moderator, and the lively audience. Enjoy the visit at COP27. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stefan Menzel, and thank you very much, our audience and the speakers here. Please engage into the discussion bilaterally. Thank you.